Hello, I'm Jayne Cravens, and in this video, I'm going to talk about the most controversial topic I have ever had a training on. I've been researching and training about the various aspects of nonprofit management and communication since the 1990s, and the most difficult training that I do is regarding diversity and inclusion in volunteer engagement. The training may not be focused on that topic in the title. The training could be on how to recruit younger volunteers, or the training could be about how to make your program more welcoming to people with disabilities. Whatever the training is, I'm going to bring up diversity and inclusion in your volunteer engagement. And the reality is that anything having to do with reaching a more diverse audience always results in at least some pushback, if not a lot of pushback. We don't need to change how we do things. We've been recruiting volunteers the same way for decades. We don't need this. You are trying to replace our older volunteers. You don't like senior citizens. Diversity is just about being politically correct. This is entirely unnecessary. The reality is that having plenty of volunteers to do all the roles and activities reserved for volunteers or created for volunteers usually is not enough to say a volunteering program is successful. Another indicator of success is if your volunteers represent a variety of ages, education levels, economic levels, and other demographics, or that they're an accurate reflection of your local community. Most programs don't want volunteers to be a homogeneous group. They want a variety of people as volunteers, and as donors, and as supporters, for that matter. Diversity makes a program a lot more interesting. It means you hear lots more ideas and different ideas, and you have access to a lot more talent, and it means your volunteers are going to have a more enriching experience. They're going to have an experience that goes beyond just getting work done. Most nonprofits, most NGOs, charities, schools, they want to demonstrate to donors and the public that anyone from the community is welcome to come in and experience the work of that organization as clients or as volunteers. So most of these organizations want a variety of people talking about what they do in the community, because that leads to more people valuing that program, more attendance at events, more donations. I have a lot of specific information on my website at the URL at the end of this video on recruitment techniques for attracting a diversity of volunteers at your program. I have another web page that I'll also note at the end of this video on how to make sure your program welcomes everyone as volunteers, that you don't have messaging or a culture that unintentionally excludes people from wanting to volunteer at your program or unintentionally drives volunteers away. But what I want to emphasize in this video is that talking about diversity and inclusion and taking steps to make that happen isn't easy, because change isn't easy. People don't like change. In fact, you may end up losing some of your volunteers, some of your long-term volunteers, because they're angry or uncomfortable that the system that they've known is changing. You know what? It may be okay to lose some of those volunteers. Holding on to one long-time volunteer who doesn't want things to change could mean excluding dozens of fantastic volunteers. That's not a good trade-off. Be ready for hostility in trying to adjust your recruitment and your support for volunteers and your roles for volunteers so that you get a bigger diversity of volunteers. Be ready for pushback, be ready for denial, and be ready for hostility. So what can that look like? Almost 20 years ago, I did a presentation in Orlando, Florida, at the National Conference for the Corporation for National Service. The presentation was regarding the emerging senior volunteer, the baby boomer. I was the representative of Generation X. Another presenter was a boomer himself, and another presenter was what was then the current senior age group. We thought this was an interesting and important but rather benign topic. The day of the presentation came. We had a room full waiting to hear from us. Our presentation began with a lot of energy. We talked about how the emerging senior volunteer, the baby boomer, might be a little different from the greatest generation volunteer. Not better, not worse, just different. We talked about how baby boomer volunteers wanted to volunteer their skills and their expertise, not just stuff envelopes. They were willing to commit a lot of hours, but they also wanted a lot of recognition. They wanted to know the difference their volunteering made. It wasn't enough to say, please do this activity. They also wanted to know, well, why? What does it matter? We saw this as a great way to make a program better for all volunteers. And we emphasized again and again, we're making sweeping generalizations about age groups. This doesn't make one group better than another group. It's just a different set of motivations, and recognizing that will make a better volunteering program for everybody. We were all but booed out of the room. The workshop attendees worked exclusively with senior volunteers, and those volunteers were primarily from the greatest generation. They did not hide their venom for our message. We knew we were in trouble early on because we could hear the sighs. We could see the folded arms. We could see the scowls. They started giving feedback. They started raising their hand and saying that the emerging senior volunteers, these baby boomers, are selfish and lazy and even un-American. One of them said, I'm not changing, and if they don't like it, they can go somewhere else. Another said, I would rather our current volunteers die off and our organization close than work with baby boomer volunteers. And one of them said to me directly, knowing I was Gen X, you don't even want to know what I think of your generation. It was by far the angriest, most hostile group I have ever presented to, and I think I'm still traumatized. In 2010, I toured Australia, talking to different associations about various aspects of volunteer management, including virtual volunteering, of course, and I talked about recruiting for diversity. Again, I always talk about recruiting for diversity and creating an atmosphere of inclusion. When I do any workshop on volunteer management, I just do. I always have. Anyway, I was talking about outreach to Indigenous groups, and one of the people in the small audience said, oh, we don't have Indigenous people here. We don't have an Indigenous community. They're in other communities, but not here. We don't have any Aboriginal people. On the way out of town, I passed a building that had a sign that said Aboriginal Cultural Center. Yes, really. Here in Oregon, a few years ago, there were articles in some of the few newspapers we still have talking about the lack of young volunteer firefighters and how the number of volunteer first responders under 50 had dropped so dramatically. I read the articles, and there were quotes from fire chiefs saying things like, well, young people today, they just don't know how to make a commitment. Or, you just can't count on young people. They just want to play on their phones. Why would any young person want to volunteer at a place that thinks of them that way? And how hard is it going to be to convince those kind of people to adjust their language, to adjust their messaging, and to adjust their management style in working with volunteers? You are going to experience this pushback for yourself if you delve into this subject matter. Diversifying your volunteer base is so much more than me providing you with a list of new places to send your press releases about volunteers. You also need to make sure that all those that support and lead volunteers at your organization or your program, and that's employees, that's senior staff, that's volunteers themselves, that they understand why your organization is committed to having a diverse core of volunteers and committed to having a feeling of inclusion and a welcoming environment at your program. Paid staff and volunteer attitudes and even their behaviors may need to be addressed and adjusted. And senior leadership must be strong in their commitment to doing this and backing you up in what you're trying to achieve in terms of diversity and inclusion. There's no finish line for this. This is a journey, and it's a nice journey. It's a fun journey. It's an interesting journey. I love this journey. I'm intimidated by this journey sometimes. I make mistakes on this journey sometimes. But I do like this pursuit, and I hope that you enjoy it as well. And I hope that you'll do it. And by the way, Susan Ellis and I talk about the importance of recruiting a diversity of volunteers and creating a welcoming atmosphere for volunteers, even online, in our book, The Last Virtual Volunteering Guidebook, available for purchase from my website. Thanks for watching. The web addresses I mentioned earlier will be at the end of this video, and they're in the description down below on this YouTube video. Tips for recruiting local volunteers to increase diversity among the ranks is available at the URL pictured and at a link in the description of this YouTube video below. There's a link there to buy my book as well. Tips for making all volunteering as accessible as possible with a list of advantages for your program is available at the URL pictured and also in the description below this YouTube video.